My name is Michael Dobson. This is Good, Fast, or Cheap, or how to use the triple constraints to define and manage project parameters. But as that cartoon on the previous slide showed you, I'm of the opinion that all of the management jokes that we tell tend to reveal some secret truths underneath. And by exploring some of what they mean, sometimes you can find important insights about management, about project management, in particular about your projects and your own situations. Let's take a look at what we're going to cover today. We're going to first find out about, we're going to discuss project constraints. We know what constraints are and in general why they matter, but they matter in ways that are over and beyond what you might have thought of previously. We're going to take a look at the hierarchy of constraints. If it's good, fast, or cheap, pick two. The question is, which two are you going to pick, and how does that help you make appropriate project decisions? We have to, you'll recall in the PMBOK guide, they talk about balancing competing demands on projects, but that's easier said than done. How do you make the right trade-offs among project constraints? As we know, are things that limit your project choices. For my project has a deadline, my project has a budget, my project has requirements. The people who are available to do work on my project have certain skills. The work of my project must be done within the envelope of certain policies, regulations, laws. And another one of the rules of project management, if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. If the customer's not happy, it's very hard to argue that in some meaningful sense that your project is an actual success. Now, constraints apply only to certain kinds of projects. If you're not building a building, then your project doesn't have to meet building codes. If you're not in a competitive situation, you don't necessarily have to beat the competition of market. If all of your work is going to stay within your own national borders, it doesn't necessarily have to work across international borders. Sometimes you want publicity, sometimes you want to avoid publicity at all costs. Constraints aren't necessarily available to you, especially at the beginning of the project. For example, if your deadline is to accomplish something ahead of your competition, you don't necessarily know when your competition is going to be complete. It's a solid deadline. It's an absolutely fixed deadline. The problem is you don't necessarily know what it is. Sometimes you have key stakeholders who want to withhold certain knowledge. Either they want to keep it to themselves. Sometimes people act on the assumption that you already know, as if somehow you know how to do the Vulcan mind meld. And a lot of times there's a fundamental assumption that everybody is in fact on board with a project, when in reality there are people who don't necessarily think the project is a good idea or that it should take place at all. Constraints aren't even real. You'll recall that during project initiation, you are supposed to make a list of project constraints and assumptions. We can see the constraints already. Excuse me. But while you are identifying constraints, understand that sometimes on some projects, people think that certain things are constraints when in fact they aren't. For example, you could have a situation where everybody thinks, well, we can't do this. We can't use this particular technique. We can't go in this direction. And why? Because we did it once in the past and it didn't work then. Well, that may still be true. There may be reasons not to go in that direction, but as an assumption, as an assumed constraint, it's rather weak. Everybody likes blue. It has to be blue. People add additional qualifications, additional requirements that aren't necessarily anchored in what the customer actually wants, needs, or cares about. And that third sounds like a joke, but I've seen this happen more times than not. A lot of projects think that the most important thing about a project is all the paperwork is done properly. Again, there are cases where in certain organizations with certain bosses that may in fact be true, but you can't afford to assume it. 3 constraints are universal. No matter what else is going on your project, no matter what other constraints that you have to deal with, full constraint of time, cost, and scope is always in there someplace. A constraint can be identified as a specific deadline, triggered by an event before X happens. It can also be expressed as a degree of urgency. Got to get this done ASAP. How soon possible is a different concern, but the degree of urgency can have time pressure on your project. Constraint is frequently regarded as being limited to money, and you'll find some people will identify the triple constraints as cost, and they'll have resources as a separate constraint. Frankly, I don't think that that's necessarily that important, or to make the distinction. The cost constraint is whatever you can spend to accomplish your project objectives. Clearly, that includes cash, but a person hour is better considered part of the cost constraint than part of the time constraint. Use of equipment, supplies, overhead. Sometimes the cost constraint is in intangibles, spending reputation, spending political capital. Whatever it is, whatever part of the cost constraint that is the tightest, is the least flexible, is the one that needs to be your number one concern. And finally, there's the scope constraint. What exactly does this puppy have to do anyway? What do I have to show at the end of the project in order to claim some degree of success? This can be expressed in functional or technical requirements. It can be expressed, especially initially, as a purpose of the project or what the desired end state is. Or a scope constraint can be designed in terms of evaluation criteria. Put them all together, you've got the triple constraint: good, fast, and cheap. In the world, the reason we're asked to pick two is that it is frequently impossible to actually achieve the trifecta. You do frequently have to make choices. And there's always some criteria that you can use to make those choices. The triple constraints, whatever they happen to be, are never exactly equal in priority. And making the right choice is essential. Now, how do you know what the right choice is? How do you know what the circumstances are? Well, to do that, let's explore some case studies and see how we can apply the triple constraints in practice. Start with the Persian Gulf War. Not all projects are wars, but all wars are pretty clearly projects. They are temporary, they are unique, they consume resources, they frequently have deadlines, and there are criteria that they have to achieve in order to define victory, what von Clausewitz calls the principle of the objective. In this particular case, we're going to look at this not from a military perspective, but just as a project management problem. Project management, of course, would be Norman Schwarzkopf. And to manage this project with the triple constraints, start, and on your projects do this too, start with a definition of failure. Because if you don't know what failure is, it's hard to really meaningfully decide what success is. Constraints. One type of failure is the whole thing takes longer than we said it was going to, takes longer than we want it to take. Another type of failure could be in the cost constraint. What if it costs more than we want to pay or that we told people we were going to pay? Of course, the third is, what if we lose? Clearly, these three kinds of failure are not equal. You just imagine Schwarzkopf going to see the President of the United States and say, hey, listen, Mr. President, I'm real sorry I lost that war, but in my defense, I'm ahead of schedule and way under budget. You can, I'll positively, that would be regarded. So there is a hierarchy of constraints: good, fast, and cheap,